The fluorescent lights of Megamart cast harsh shadows across the polished linoleum floors as customers moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency. The store buzzed with the familiar sounds of suburban commerce. Shopping carts rolling, children chattering, the distant beep of checkout scanners. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in suburban Atlanta, the kind of day when nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. Theodore Washington stood in aisle 7, his weathered hands carefully examining a pack of batteries. At 52 years old, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had served his community for over 2 decades. His broad shoulders filled out a simple navy polo shirt, and his graying hair was neatly trimmed. There was something unmistakably authoritative about his presence, though he wore it lightly, without arrogance or pretension. Theodore had stopped by the store on his way home from the firehouse, still carrying the subtle scent of smoke and the weight of responsibility that never quite left his shoulders. As Battalion Chief of Engine Company 19, he was used to making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. But here, in this ordinary store, surrounded by everyday shoppers, he was just another customer looking for household supplies. The batteries were for his grandson's remote-controlled car, a small gift he'd promised to fix after the boy had tearfully shown him the broken toy. Theodore smiled slightly as he imagined the child's excitement when the car roared back to life. These small moments of joy were what he lived for now, simple pleasures that reminded him why he dedicated his life to protecting others. As he reached for a pack of AA batteries on the upper shelf, Theodore felt eyes on him. It was a sensation he'd grown familiar with over the years, an uncomfortable awareness that came from being watched, judged, and found suspicious simply for existing in certain spaces. Didn't turn around immediately, hoping the feeling would pass, but it only intensified. David Hoffman, the store manager, emerged from behind a display of seasonal items, his pale face flushed with what he would later claim was concern for store security. Hoffman was a thin man in his early 40s, with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down his nose. He'd been watching Theodore through the security monitors in his office, convinced he'd spotted a potential shoplifter. Something about Theodore's measured movements, his careful examination of products, and the way he'd been in the store for 15 minutes without making a purchase had triggered Hoffman's suspicions. In his narrow worldview, these were clear indicators of criminal intent, though anyone with common sense would recognize them as the behaviors of a thoughtful shopper. Hoffman approached with calculated steps, his clipboard clutched tightly against his chest like a shield. The store's security guard, Isaiah Brown, followed reluctantly behind. Isaiah was a young black man in his early 20s, working part-time while attending community college. He wore his uniform with obvious discomfort, knowing all too well what it felt like to be on the receiving end of unwarranted suspicion. "Excuse me, sir," Hoffman said, his voice carrying an edge that immediately drew attention from nearby shoppers. "I need to ask what you're doing in this aisle." Theodore turned slowly, his expression calm but alert. He'd heard that tone before, the barely concealed accusation wrapped in feigned politeness. His eyes met Hoffman's, and he saw the familiar mixture of fear and prejudice that had shadowed him throughout his life. "I'm shopping for batteries," Theodore replied evenly, holding up the pack he'd selected. His voice carried the measured authority of someone accustomed to diffusing tense situations, though beneath the calm surface, he felt the familiar sting of being singled out. Hoffman's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the batteries, then back at Theodore. "You've been in here for quite a while. Are you planning to purchase anything?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, acrid and unmistakable in its implications. Other shoppers had begun to notice the confrontation, some stopping to watch while others hurried past, uncomfortable with the obvious tension but unwilling to intervene. Theodore felt the familiar weight settle on his shoulders. The burden of representing not just himself, but every black man who might walk into this store in the future. He knew that his response would be scrutinized, dissected, and used to justify whatever action Hoffman had already decided to take. "I'm planning to purchase these batteries," Theodore said, his voice remaining steady despite the growing humiliation. "Is there a problem with that?" Hoffman adjusted his glasses, a nervous tic that betrayed his uncertainty even as he pressed forward with his unfounded suspicions. "We've had issues with theft in this area. I'm going to need to see some identification and check your receipt for any previous purchases." The demand was unreasonable, and Theodore knew it. He hadn't purchased anything yet, so there would be no receipt to show. The request for identification was nothing more than harassment, a power play designed to humiliate and control. But Theodore also knew that refusing would likely escalate the situation beyond his control. Isaiah shifted uncomfortably beside his manager, his young face a mask of conflict. He could see the quiet dignity in Theodore's bearing, the way the older man carried himself with unmistakable honor. Every instinct told him that this was wrong, that they were harassing an innocent man, but his need for the job kept him silent. "Sir," Theodore said, his patience beginning to strain, "I haven't made any purchases to have a receipt for, and I don't believe you have the right to demand my identification when I haven't done anything wrong." The words were reasonable, logical, and completely accurate under the law. But Hoffman heard them as defiance, as a challenge to his authority that couldn't be tolerated. His face reddened as he stepped closer, invading Theodore's personal space with deliberate intimidation. "Don't tell me what my rights are in my own store," Hoffman snapped, his voice rising enough to draw even more attention. "I have the right to ask anyone for identification if I suspect shoplifting." Theodore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his composure. He'd faced down burning buildings, rescued people from car wrecks, and made life-or-death decisions under pressure that would break most men. He wouldn't be intimidated by a small-minded store manager drunk on petty authority. "What exactly do you suspect me of shoplifting?" Theodore asked, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that those who knew him would recognize as a warning. "I'm holding one pack of batteries that I haven't paid for because I haven't finished shopping." Hoffman gestured vaguely at Theodore's clothing, his clipboard, the way he stood. "You're acting suspicious. You've been loitering, examining merchandise without buying anything. That's consistent with shoplifting behavior." The accusation was so absurd, so obviously rooted in racial prejudice, that several customers openly scoffed. An elderly white woman nearby shook her head in disgust, while a young mother pulled her children closer, not from fear of Theodore but from embarrassment at witnessing such blatant discrimination. Theodore looked around at the faces watching him, some sympathetic, others curious, a few hostile. He thought about his grandson, about the car he'd promised to fix, about the simple errand that had turned into a public humiliation. He thought about his uniform hanging in his locker at the firehouse, about the lives he'd saved and the respect he'd earned through decades of service. "I'm going to pay for these batteries and leave," Theodore said finally, his dignity intact despite the circumstances. "If you'll excuse me." He started toward the checkout lanes, but Hoffman wasn't finished. The manager had committed to his course of action and couldn't back down without losing face. He nodded to Isaiah, who reluctantly stepped forward to block Theodore's path. "I'm sorry, sir," Isaiah said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but we need you to come with us to the office." Theodore stopped, his eyes meeting the young security guards. He could see the conflict there, the shame and reluctance that told him Isaiah didn't want to be part of this. But he also saw the uniform, the authority it represented, and the choice being forced upon him. "On what grounds?" Theodore asked quietly. Hoffman pushed past Isaiah, his confidence growing with each moment of defiance. Suspicious behavior, failure to cooperate with store personnel, and potential shoplifting. Either you come with us voluntarily, or we'll call the police. The threat hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Theodore knew that calling the police would likely result in his arrest, regardless of his innocence. He'd seen too many situations escalate when law enforcement arrived to find a black man in conflict with white authority. His own experience as a first responder had taught him how quickly things could spiral out of control. But he also knew that complying would validate Hoffman's actions, would send a message to every other minority who entered this store that they could be harassed and humiliated at will. The choice before him wasn't just about batteries or shopping. It was about dignity, justice, and the kind of world he wanted to leave for his grandson. Theodore took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every eye in the store upon him. He thought about the oath he'd taken as a firefighter, the promise to protect and serve his community regardless of personal cost. He thought about the values his father had instilled in him, the lessons learned through decades of quiet perseverance in the face of systemic prejudice. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said finally, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent store. "I'm a customer trying to make a legitimate purchase. If you want to call the police because I won't submit to harassment, then make your call." The challenge was unmistakable, delivered with the quiet authority of a man who had spent his life standing up for what was right. Hoffman's face flushed deeper as he realized the situation had moved beyond his control. He'd expected submission, compliance, the kind of quiet acceptance that would allow him to exert his power without consequence. Instead, he faced a man who refused to be intimidated, whose very presence commanded respect even in the face of obvious discrimination. The store had fallen nearly silent, customers frozen in uncomfortable witness to a scene that would haunt many of them for years to come. Hoffman pulled out his phone with shaking hands, his authority crumbling even as he clung to it desperately. "Fine, I'm calling the police. You can explain your behavior to them." Theodore nodded once, accepting the escalation with the same calm dignity he'd maintained throughout the encounter. He knew what was coming, knew that the next few hours would test everything he believed about justice and the system he'd spent his life serving. But he also knew that some battles had to be fought, regardless of the personal cost. As Hoffman's voice carried across the store, requesting police assistance for a suspicious individual refusing to cooperate, Theodore Washington stood his ground. He thought about his grandson waiting at home, about the promise he'd made to fix a simple toy, about all the promises society had made and broken to men like him. The batteries remained clutched in his hand, a simple purchase that had become the catalyst for something much larger. Around him, the store buzzed with whispered conversations and uncomfortable glances, while somewhere in the distance, sirens began their familiar wail. The first police cruiser arrived within 6 minutes of Hoffman's call, its red and blue lights casting eerie patterns through the store's large windows. Officer Lisa Hayes stepped out of the vehicle, a 10-year veteran of the force with a reputation for fair dealing and community engagement. She was a compact woman with auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform pressed and her bearing professional. Officer Hayes had responded to calls at Megamart before, usually for actual shoplifting incidents or minor disturbances. As she walked through the automatic doors, she expected to find the typical scene: a nervous shoplifter caught red-handed, maybe some stolen merchandise, and a straightforward arrest. What she found instead was a tableau that immediately raised her suspicions about the nature of the call. Theodore Washington stood in the center of a loose circle of onlookers, his posture erect and his expression calm. He still held the pack of batteries in his right hand, making no attempt to conceal them. His entire demeanor spoke of a man waiting patiently for justice to run its course, not someone caught in criminal activity. Hoffman hurried toward Officer Hayes, his clipboard clutched against his chest and his face flushed with nervous energy. "Officer," Thank goodness you're here. This man has been acting suspiciously, loitering in the store, and when I tried to question him, he became belligerent and refused to cooperate. Hayes looked from Hoffman to Theodore, her trained eye taking in details that painted a different picture than the store manager's breathless account. Theodore's clothing was neat and clean, his bearing respectful, and he showed no signs of the agitation or guilt typically associated with criminal activity. "Sir?" Hayes addressed Theodore directly. "Can you tell me what's happening here?" Theodore met her gaze steadily, recognizing in her manner a professionalism that had been absent from his encounter with Hoffman. "Officer, I came into the store to buy batteries for my grandson's toy. I've been here perhaps 20 minutes, shopping normally, when the manager approached me and began making accusations without any basis. I haven't stolen anything, I haven't threatened anyone, and I haven't broken any laws." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being believed, to having his word taken seriously in matters of life and death. Officer Hayes found herself immediately impressed by his composure and the clarity of his account. "He's lying," Hoffman interjected, his voice rising with frustration. "I watched him on the security cameras. He was casing the store, examining merchandise he had no intention of buying. When I confronted him, he became hostile and refused to show identification." Hayes held up a hand to silence Hoffman, her attention focused on Theodore. "Sir, do you have identification with you?" "I do," Theodore replied, reaching slowly into his wallet. "But I don't believe I'm required to provide it unless I'm suspected of a specific crime. Being in a store isn't illegal." As Theodore handed over his driver's license, Hayes noted the steady confidence of his movements, the absence of any attempt to evade or deceive. She glanced at the license and felt her eyebrows rise slightly at the address. Theodore lived in one of the area's more upscale neighborhoods, hardly the profile of a typical shoplifter. "Mr. Washington," she said, reading from the license, "what do you do for work?" Theodore straightened slightly, pride evident in his bearing. "I'm Battalion Chief with the Atlanta Fire Department, Engine Company 19. The words hit Officer Hayes like a physical blow. She'd worked with the fire department numerous times, had seen firsthand the courage and dedication of its members. The idea that a fire chief would be harassed while shopping for batteries struck her as not just wrong, but deeply offensive to everything she believed about justice and respect. Hoffman's face had gone pale at the revelation, but he pressed forward with stubborn desperation. "That doesn't change anything. I don't care what his job is. He was acting suspicious in my store." Hayes turned to face the store manager, her expression hardening. "Mr. Hoffman, what specifically did you observe that you considered suspicious behavior?" He was examining merchandise for a long time without buying anything. He was loitering, moving slowly through the aisles like he was planning something. The weakness of the accusations was apparent to everyone within earshot. Several customers shook their heads in disgust, and Hayes felt her own patience beginning to fray. She'd seen this scenario too many times, minority customers harassed by overzealous store personnel whose suspicions were rooted in prejudice rather than evidence. "Mr. Hoffman," Hayes said carefully, "looking at merchandise and taking time to make purchasing decisions are normal shopping behaviors. Unless you have evidence of actual criminal activity, I don't see grounds for any police action." Isaiah Brown, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally found his voice. "Officer, if I may," he said hesitantly, glancing nervously at his manager. "I was watching too, and honestly, the gentleman wasn't doing anything unusual. He was just shopping like any other customer." Hoffman whirled on his security guard, his face flushing with anger. "You're paid to support store security, not contradict me in front of the police." "I'm paid to tell the truth," Isaiah replied with growing confidence, drawing strength from Officer Hayes's professional demeanor. "And the truth is, this man didn't do anything wrong." The tension in the store was palpable, customers shifting uncomfortably as they witnessed the confrontation. Some had pulled out their phones, recording the scene with the instinctive understanding that they were witnessing something significant. Hayes looked around at the gathered crowd, noting their expressions of sympathy for Theodore and disgust at the situation. She'd been a police officer long enough to read a scene, and everything she saw told her that a good man was being persecuted for the crime of shopping while black. "Mr. Washington," she said, turning back to Theodore, "I apologize for the inconvenience. As far as I can see, you haven't violated any laws. Would you like to complete your purchase and go home?" Theodore nodded gratefully, but Hoffman wasn't finished. The store manager had gone too far to back down now, his authority and judgment publicly questioned by his own employee and dismissed by the police. In his mind, allowing Theodore to simply walk away would be an admission of wrongdoing that he couldn't accept. "Officer Hayes," Hoffman said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, "I want this man trespassed from the store. I don't want him coming back." The request was legal but vindictive, a final punishment for Theodore's refusal to submit to harassment. Hayes looked at Hoffman with undisguised contempt, recognizing the trespass order for what it was, a petty act of revenge against a man whose only crime had been shopping with dignity. "That's your right as a property owner," Hayes said reluctantly, "but I want to be clear that this gentleman has done nothing to warrant such action." Theodore handed the batteries to Officer Hayes with quiet dignity. "I won't be shopping here anymore anyway," he said, his voice carrying a sadness that went beyond personal disappointment. "And I'll make sure my friends and family know how customers are treated at Megamart." As Theodore prepared to leave, a woman's voice cut through the tension. "This is disgusting," shouted Keandra Johnson, a 35-year-old social worker who had witnessed the entire encounter. "This man is being harassed for absolutely nothing." Her outburst seemed to break the spell of uncomfortable silence that had held the other customers in check. Several people began voicing their agreement, their anger at the injustice they'd witnessed overcoming their reluctance to get involved. "I saw the whole thing," called out an elderly white man. "He didn't do anything wrong." "This is racial profiling, pure and simple," added a young mother, her voice shaking with emotion. The store erupted in a chorus of disapproval directed at Hoffman, who found himself facing the very public condemnation he'd tried to avoid. His attempt to exert authority had backfired spectacularly, turning him into the villain in a story that would spread far beyond the confines of his store. Officer Hayes felt the situation spiraling beyond her control as more customers joined the verbal confrontation. She knew that unless she acted quickly, the peaceful protest could escalate into something more serious. "Everyone needs to calm down," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of her badge. "Mr. Washington is free to go, and I suggest everyone else continue with their shopping." But the damage was already done. Word of the incident was spreading through the store like wildfire, with customers calling friends and family to share what they'd witnessed. The age of social media meant that Theodore's humiliation would be broadcast far beyond the walls of Megamart within hours. As Theodore walked toward the exit, his head held high despite the circumstances, he felt the eyes of every person in the store upon him. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with admiration for his dignity under pressure, and a few with the uncomfortable recognition that they had witnessed an injustice and done nothing to prevent it. Officer Hayes watched him go with a heavy heart, knowing that her job required her to maintain neutrality but feeling personally offended by what she'd witnessed. She'd sworn an oath to protect and serve all citizens equally, and seeing a decorated public servant treated with such disrespect violated everything she believed about justice. As the automatic doors closed behind Theodore, the store gradually returned to its normal rhythm. But something had changed. The comfortable assumptions that allowed places like Megamart to function smoothly had been shattered by the raw display of prejudice and power. Customers moved through the aisles with new awareness, their shopping experience forever altered by what they'd seen. Outside in the parking lot, Theodore sat in his truck for several minutes, his hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline of confrontation finally caught up with him. He thought about the batteries he'd never purchased, about the promise he'd made to his grandson, about the simple errand that had become a public humiliation. But he also thought about Isaiah Brown, the young security guard who had found the courage to speak the truth despite the risk to his job. He thought about Officer Hayes, whose professionalism had prevented the situation from escalating further. And he thought about the customers who had spoken up in his defense, strangers who had recognized injustice and refused to remain silent. As he started his truck and began the drive home, Theodore Washington carried with him the weight of what had happened and the growing determination to ensure that his humiliation would not be in vain. He had no idea that his quiet dignity in the face of discrimination had already begun to ripple outward, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways he could never have imagined. The incident at Megamart was over, but its consequences were just beginning. The Atlanta Fire Department's engine company, 19 Firehouse, stood as a beacon of community service in the heart of the city's East Side neighborhood. The red brick building, weathered by decades of service but maintained with military precision, housed not just firefighting equipment but the dreams and dedication of men and women who had chosen to risk their lives for others. Theodore Washington's office occupied a corner of the second floor, its windows offering a view of the neighborhood he'd spent 23 years protecting. The walls displayed commendations, photographs from major incidents, and thank you letters from families whose lives had been touched by his service. It was a sanctuary of purpose in a world that often seemed chaotic and unfair. 3 days had passed since the Megamart incident, and Theodore had tried to put the humiliation behind him. He'd fixed his grandson's toy car as promised, finding solace in the child's delighted laughter when the vehicle roared back to life. He'd returned to his duties with characteristic professionalism, leading his crew through training exercises and responding to calls with the same dedication that had defined his career. But the incident haunted him in quiet moments, surfacing when he least expected it like smoke from a smoldering fire. He'd catch himself replaying the confrontation, wondering if he could have handled it differently, questioning whether his response had been too passive or too confrontational. The doubt was corrosive, eating away at his usual confidence and leaving him feeling somehow diminished. The knock on his office door interrupted his brooding thoughts. "Come in," he called, straightening the papers on his desk in an unconscious effort to project normalcy. Captain Tyrone Davis entered, his expression a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. Davis was Theodore's second-in-command, a 15-year veteran whose loyalty to his chief was absolute. He'd served under Theodore through countless emergencies, had seen the man's courage and compassion firsthand, and considered him not just a superior officer but a mentor and friend. "Chief," Davis said, closing the door behind him, "we need to talk." Theodore gestured to the chair across from his desk, noting the tension in his captain's bearing. "What's on your mind, Tyrone?" Davis settled into the chair, his usually relaxed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. "I heard about what happened at Megamart. The whole department's talking about it." Theodore felt his stomach drop. He'd hoped the incident would remain private, a personal humiliation that wouldn't reflect on his professional reputation. "How did you find out?" "Social media," Davis replied grimly. "Someone recorded parts of it and posted the video online. It's gone viral, Chief. Thousands of people have seen it, and the number's growing by the hour." The news hit Theodore like a physical blow. The thought of his humiliation being broadcast to strangers across the internet made him feel exposed and vulnerable in ways he'd never experienced. "What exactly is on the video?" Davis pulled out his phone, scrolling through the footage with obvious reluctance. "It shows the store manager confronting you, the argument with the security guard, and your conversation with Officer Hayes." The person filming was smart enough to capture the sound clearly. Theodore watched the video with growing dismay, seeing himself from an outside perspective for the first time. What struck him wasn't his own dignity, that came through clearly, but the obvious injustice of the situation. The contrast between his calm professionalism and Hoffman's aggressive harassment was stark and undeniable. "The comments are overwhelmingly in your support," Davis continued. "People are outraged by what they're seeing. The fire department's Facebook page is flooded with messages of support, and there are calls for boycotts of Megamart. Theodore closed his eyes, feeling the weight of unwanted attention settling on his shoulders. I never wanted this to become public. Chief, Davis said, leaning forward intently, you need to understand something. This isn't just about you anymore. People are seeing this video and recognizing their own experiences, their own humiliations. You've become a symbol of something bigger. The words carried a truth that Theodore had been trying to avoid. He'd spent his career focusing on individual acts of service, rescuing people from burning buildings and car accidents without considering the broader implications. But the video had thrust him into a larger conversation about race, respect, and justice that he wasn't sure he was prepared to navigate. The mayor's office called, Davis continued. They want to arrange a meeting with you and the fire chief. The media is starting to pick up the story, and they want to get ahead of it. Theodore rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. I'm a firefighter, not a civil rights leader. I just want to do my job and go home to my family. I understand that, Davis said gently, but sometimes circumstances choose us rather than the other way around. What happened to you was wrong, and people need to see that there are consequences for that kind of behavior. Before Theodore could respond, his desk phone rang with the sharp insistence that indicated an emergency call. Years of training took over as he answered with crisp professionalism. Battalion Chief, Washington. The voice on the other end belonged to the emergency dispatcher, her tone urgent but controlled. Chief, we have a structure fire at 1247 Maple Street. Multiple families trapped on upper floors. Engine 19 is first out. Copy that, we're en route. Theodore stood immediately, his personal troubles pushed aside by the immediate demands of his job. As he grabbed his helmet and protective gear, he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline and purpose that had sustained him through decades of service. This was who he was, not a victim of discrimination, but a protector and servant of his community. The fire scene was chaos, controlled by training and experience. Flames erupted from the second-floor windows of a converted apartment building, while terrified residents clustered on the street below. Theodore assessed the situation with the practiced eye of a veteran, coordinating the attack on the fire while ensuring the safety of his crew and the civilians they'd sworn to protect. Davis, take a team through the front entrance and start evacuating the first floor, Theodore commanded, his voice cutting through the noise of shouting residents and roaring flames. Williams, get the ladder truck positioned for upper floor rescues. I want water on that fire in 3 minutes. As his crew sprang into action with the precision of a well-trained unit, Theodore focused on the bigger picture. The building's layout, the wind direction, the location of trapped residents, all of these factors flowed through his mind as he orchestrated the rescue effort with the skill that had made him one of the department's most respected chiefs. The first family emerged from the burning building coughing and crying, their relief palpable as they were led to safety by Theodore's crew. An elderly man clutched a photograph to his chest, his eyes wide with shock at how quickly his world had changed. A young mother held her infant close while firefighters checked them for signs of smoke inhalation. But there were still people trapped on the upper floors, their silhouettes visible in windows filled with smoke and terror. Theodore knew that time was running out, that the fire's growth would soon make rescue impossible. Without hesitation, he grabbed his oxygen mask and headed toward the building's entrance. "Chief, you shouldn't go in there," Davis called out, recognizing the dangerous determination in his superior's stance. "Let the younger guys handle it." Theodore paused at the threshold, looking back at his captain with the same calm authority he'd displayed at Megamart. "This is what we do, Tyrone. This is who we are." Inside the burning building, the heat was overwhelming despite his protective gear. Smoke filled the corridors like a living thing, reducing visibility to mere feet and making each breath a conscious effort. Theodore moved through the familiar routine of search and rescue, his training overriding the natural human instinct to flee from danger. He found them on the second floor, a family of 4 huddled in a back bedroom, the parents desperately trying to protect their children from the encroaching flames and smoke. The father looked up as Theodore appeared in the doorway, his face a mixture of terror and hope that spoke to the primal human need for salvation. "Fire department," Theodore announced, his voice muffled by the oxygen mask but carrying unmistakable authority. "I'm here to get you out." The evacuation was textbook perfect. The family guided through smoke-filled corridors with the efficiency that came from countless hours of training and years of experience. Theodore's calm presence gave them confidence even as the building groaned around them, its structural integrity weakened by the relentless assault of flames. As they emerged into the cool evening air, the crowd of onlookers erupted in cheers. The rescued family clung to each other, their relief overwhelming now that they were safe. The father, still coughing from smoke inhalation, grabbed Theodore's arm with desperate gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, tears streaming down his soot-stained face. "Thank you for saving my family." Theodore nodded, accepting the thanks with the quiet humility that characterized all his interactions. He'd done his job, nothing more and nothing less. But as he looked around at the crowd of grateful residents, he saw something that struck him like lightning. Among the faces watching him with admiration and respect were several people he recognized from the Megamart video. Keandra Johnson stood near the fire truck, her expression a mixture of awe and vindication. The elderly man who had spoken up in his defense was there too, his eyes bright with pride as he watched Theodore coordinate the final stages of the fire suppression. But it was the presence of a television news crew that truly drove home the reality of his situation. The reporter, a sharp-dressed woman with perfectly styled hair, was setting up for a live broadcast with the burning building as her backdrop. Theodore realized that his heroic actions would be broadcast alongside the humiliation he'd suffered 3 days earlier, creating a powerful juxtaposition that would amplify both stories. As the fire was finally brought under control and his crew began the methodical process of ensuring there were no remaining hot spots, Theodore felt the weight of his dual roles settling on his shoulders. He was simultaneously a victim of discrimination and a community hero, a man denied respect in a store but revered when lives were at stake. The contradiction was both painful and enlightening, highlighting the complex nature of respect and recognition in American society. In his uniform, with his badge and his authority, he was unquestionably valuable. But in civilian clothes, shopping for batteries for his grandson, he was just another black man to be suspected and harassed. The news reporter approached as Theodore supervised the final cleanup, her cameraman already filming. "Battalion Chief Washington, I'm Rebecca Torres from Channel 7 News. Could we have a moment of your time?" Theodore looked at the camera, then back at the reporter, understanding that his response would become part of a larger narrative that was already spinning beyond his control. He thought about his family, his crew, his community, and the responsibility that came with unwanted prominence. "Of course," he said finally, removing his helmet to reveal hair damp with sweat and eyes bright with purpose. "But let's focus on the real heroes tonight, my crew and the first responders who risked their lives to save others." As the interview began, Theodore Washington found himself at a crossroads he'd never expected to face. The quiet dignity that had sustained him through decades of service was about to be tested in ways he could never have imagined, and the choices he made in the coming days would ripple far beyond his own life. The fire was out, but a different kind of conflagration was just beginning to burn. The Atlanta morning sun filtered through the windows of Theodore's modest suburban home, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that his late wife had lovingly polished every Saturday. The house, purchased 20 years ago when their combined salaries could still afford the American dream, reflected the careful stewardship of a man who valued stability and permanence above ostentation. Theodore sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands as he stared at his phone screen in disbelief. Overnight, the video from Megamart had exploded across social media platforms with a viral intensity that seemed to defy comprehension. The view count had climbed past 2 million, and the comment section had become a battlefield of opinions about race, justice, and respect in America. The juxtaposition of the store incident with footage of him rescuing the family from the burning building had created a narrative that seemed almost too perfect for reality. News outlets across the country had picked up the story, framing it as a powerful indictment of racial profiling and a testament to the character of the man who had been wronged. His phone buzzed with another incoming call from a number he didn't recognize. It was the 15th such call since sunrise, each one from a reporter, television producer, or documentary filmmaker seeking an interview. Theodore had stopped answering after the first few, overwhelmed by the sudden transformation from private citizen to public figure. The doorbell rang, followed by a knock that carried the insistent rhythm of someone who wouldn't easily be turned away. Theodore peered through the front window and saw a cluster of news vans parked along his normally quiet street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical sunflowers seeking signal instead of light. A perfectly coiffed reporter stood on his front porch, her camera crew arranged behind her with military precision. Theodore recognized her from the evening news, Sandra Mitchell from Channel 2, known for her aggressive pursuit of stories and her ability to extract quotes from reluctant subjects. He didn't answer the door. Instead, he retreated to his home office, a small room that had served as his sanctuary since his wife's death 3 years earlier. The walls were lined with certificates and awards, testament to a career built on service and sacrifice. A framed photograph of his fire crew stood prominently on the desk, their faces reflecting the camaraderie that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his professional life. Theodore's phone rang again, but this time the caller ID showed a familiar name, Fire Chief Robert Anderson. Theodore answered immediately, grateful for contact with someone who understood the weight of command and the burden of public responsibility. "Theodore," Anderson's gravelly voice carried both concern and urgency. "We need to talk. Can you come in early today?" "Of course, Chief. Is there a problem?" "There's a situation developing. The mayor's office, the city council, and half the media in Atlanta want to meet with you. This story has gotten bigger than anyone anticipated." Theodore looked out his office window at the news crews camped on his street, their presence transforming his neighborhood into something resembling a crime scene. "I can see that, Chief. I never wanted this kind of attention." "I know you didn't," Anderson replied, his tone softening with understanding. "But sometimes circumstances choose us rather than the other way around. You handled yourself with dignity in an impossible situation, and now the whole country is watching to see what happens next." After ending the call, Theodore dressed in his uniform with extra care, knowing that every public appearance would be scrutinized and analyzed. The familiar weight of his badges and insignia provided comfort, a reminder of his identity beyond the viral video that had made him an unwilling celebrity. The drive to the firehouse required navigating a gauntlet of reporters and cameras. Theodore kept his windows up and his eyes forward, refusing to be drawn into impromptu interviews that could be taken out of context. The media attention felt invasive and dehumanizing, reducing his complex identity to a simple narrative of victim and hero. At the firehouse, Captain Davis met him at the back entrance, his expression grim but supportive. "It's a zoo out there, Chief. The front of the building is surrounded by news trucks. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but protective. Theodore's crew had closed ranks around their leader, their loyalty absolute despite the chaos swirling around them. These men and women had fought fires alongside him, had seen his courage under pressure, and had benefited from his leadership in countless dangerous situations. "Chief," said Lieutenant Marcus Thompson, a 20-year veteran whose respect for Theodore was legendary throughout the department, "we want you to know that we're behind you 100%. What happened at that store was wrong, and everyone can see it." The support of his crew meant more to Theodore than all the social media comments and news coverage combined. These were people who knew his character intimately, who had trusted him with their lives and had never been disappointed. Their faith in him provided strength for the challenges ahead. Fire Chief Anderson appeared in the doorway of the equipment bay, his weathered face reflecting decades of dealing with crises, both professional and political. At 62, Anderson had navigated the department through budget cuts, personnel changes, and public relations disasters with the skill of a veteran diplomat. "Theodore, we need to talk privately," Anderson said, gesturing toward his office. The chief's office was spartanly furnished but warm, filled with photographs of firefighters past and present and memorabilia from a career spent in service to others. Anderson closed the door and gestured for Theodore to sit, his manner suggesting the gravity of their conversation. "The mayor wants to honor you with a commendation for the rescue at the apartment fire," Anderson began. "But she also wants to use the ceremony to address the Megamart incident. The city's legal department thinks it could help them in potential litigation." Theodore felt his stomach tighten with unease. "Chief, I don't want to be used as a political prop. I just want to do my job and get back to normal life." Anderson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Theodore, I understand that sentiment, but I'm not sure normal life is an option anymore. This story has touched something deep in people, and they're looking to you for leadership, whether you want it or not. But I'm not a civil rights leader or a political activist. I'm a firefighter who happened to get harassed while shopping for batteries." "You're also a black man in uniform who represents something important to a lot of people," Anderson replied gently. "Your dignity in the face of that harassment, followed by your heroism at the fire, has created a powerful narrative about character and service." Theodore stared out the office window at the news trucks gathered in the station's parking lot, their occupants waiting patiently for any glimpse of the man who had become the center of a national conversation. The weight of unwanted responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy coat. "What are my options, Chief?" Anderson pulled out a folder thick with documents and messages. "The mayor wants to meet with you this afternoon. There are interview requests from every major news network. The NAACP wants you to speak at their annual dinner. Community groups are asking you to endorse their causes." The list seemed endless, each request representing another step away from the quiet life Theodore had built for himself. He thought about his grandson, about the simple joy of fixing a toy car without it becoming a symbol of anything larger than a grandfather's love. "There's something else," Anderson continued, his tone becoming more serious. "Our legal department has been contacted by several lawyers who want to represent you in a potential lawsuit against Megamart. They're talking about significant damages for the discrimination you suffered." Theodore had not considered the possibility of legal action, focused as he had been on simply moving past the humiliation. The idea of prolonging the conflict through litigation felt exhausting, but he also recognized that his experience might prevent similar treatment of others. "Have you given any thought to what you want to say publicly about all this?" Anderson asked. Theodore was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that would define his path forward. He thought about his wife, who had always encouraged him to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. He thought about his grandson, who would grow up in a world shaped partly by the choices Theodore made in these crucial moments. "I want people to understand that what happened to me happens to others every day," Theodore said finally. "The only difference is that I had the privilege of being rescued by circumstances and a job that commands respect. Most people don't have that protection." Anderson nodded approvingly. "That's a powerful message, Theodore. It's also one that requires careful delivery if it's going to create positive change rather than just more division." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Captain Davis entered, his expression urgent. "Chief, excuse the interruption, but there's someone here who says she needs to speak with you immediately. She's from the store, the security guard who was there that day." Theodore felt his pulse quicken with surprise and curiosity. "Isaiah Brown is here?" "No, Chief. It's a woman. She says her name is Keandra Johnson and that she witnessed everything that happened to you. She seems pretty upset about something." Anderson looked at Theodore with raised eyebrows. "Do you want to see her?" Theodore nodded, his curiosity overriding his reluctance to revisit the painful incident. "Send her in." Keandra Johnson entered the office with obvious nervousness, her hands twisting the strap of her purse as she took in the formal setting. She was a woman in her mid-30s with kind eyes and an expression that spoke of someone carrying a heavy burden of conscience. "Battalion Chief Washington," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry to bother you at work, but I had to come. I was there that day at Megamart, and I saw everything that happened to you." Theodore stood and offered her a chair, his manner gentle and encouraging. "I remember you. You spoke up for me." "I did, but not soon enough and not loud enough," Keandra replied, settling into the chair with visible agitation. "I've been watching the news coverage and reading the comments online, and I can't sleep knowing that there's more to this story that people need to hear." Chief Anderson leaned forward with interest. "What do you mean, more to the story?" Keandra took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was clearly a difficult revelation. "The store manager, David Hoffman, he's done this before. Many times. I've seen him harass other customers, always minorities, always with the same pattern of accusations and humiliation." Theodore felt anger rising in his chest, not just for himself, but for all the unknown victims who had suffered similar treatment. "Have you reported this?" "I tried once about 6 months ago, after I saw him make a young Hispanic mother cry in front of her children. I called the store's corporate office, but they said they would investigate, and then nothing happened. Hoffman was still there, still treating people badly." Chief Anderson exchanged glances with Theodore, both men recognizing the significance of this revelation. "Ms. Johnson, would you be willing to make a formal statement about what you've witnessed?" "That's why I'm here," Keandra said, her voice growing stronger with resolve. "I know that coming forward might cause problems for me, but I can't stay silent anymore. What happened to you was wrong, but it's part of a bigger pattern that needs to be exposed." Theodore felt a surge of gratitude for this woman's courage, recognizing in her the same moral conviction that had driven him to refuse Hoffman's unreasonable demands. "Ms. Johnson, I want you to know how much I appreciate your willingness to speak up. It takes courage to get involved in something like this. It takes more courage to stay silent when you know something is wrong," Keandra replied, echoing the values that had shaped Theodore's own life of service. As the conversation continued, Theodore began to understand that his individual experience was indeed part of a larger pattern of systematic discrimination. The weight of that knowledge brought both burden and purpose, transforming his personal humiliation into a catalyst for broader change. The media storm outside the firehouse continued to grow, but inside Chief Anderson's office, the foundation was being laid for something more significant than a simple news story. Theodore Washington was about to discover that sometimes the greatest fires to fight are not the ones that threaten buildings, but the ones that burn away justice and human dignity. The real battle was just beginning. The law offices of Coleman Hayes and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown Atlanta high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city Theodore had spent his career protecting. The firm's reputation for civil rights litigation was legendary, built on decades of challenging institutional discrimination and winning justice for those the system had failed. Tyrone Davis, Esquire, was not related to Captain Davis from the fire department, but his reputation preceded him into any room he entered. At 45, he had already argued cases before the Supreme Court and had secured multi-million-dollar settlements against corporations and government entities guilty of discrimination. His presence commanded respect, not through intimidation, but through the quiet confidence of a man who had never lost sight of justice. Theodore sat across from Davis in the attorney's spacious office, still wearing his fire department uniform as he had come directly from a morning training session. The contrast between his working-class background and the lawyer's elegant surroundings was stark but not uncomfortable. Both men understood the dignity that came from serving others, whether through fighting fires or fighting injustice. "Chief Washington," Davis began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. "I've reviewed the video footage, witness statements, and background information about this case. What happened to you represents a clear violation of your civil rights under both federal and state law." Theodore shifted in the leather chair, his discomfort with legal proceedings evident in his posture. "Mr. Davis, I appreciate your interest in helping, but I need to understand what pursuing this legally would mean for me and my family. I never asked to become a public figure." Davis leaned forward, his expression both understanding and determined. "I respect that concern, Chief, but you need to understand the broader implications of what happened to you. This isn't just about one incident in one store. It's about a pattern of behavior that has affected countless others." The lawyer opened a thick file folder, revealing documents, photographs, and witness statements that represented weeks of investigation. "Since your story went viral, my office has been contacted by 17 other individuals who have experienced similar treatment at Megamart locations across the Southeast. The pattern is consistent. Minorities are targeted for suspicious behavior that would be considered normal for white customers." Theodore felt his stomach tighten as he absorbed the scope of the discrimination. 17 people? And that's just the ones brave enough to come forward. Our investigation suggests the problem is much more widespread. Davis pulled out a series of internal corporate documents. "We've obtained evidence through discovery that Megamart corporate headquarters was aware of discriminatory practices at multiple locations and failed to take corrective action." The attorney spread the documents across the conference table, each one representing another piece of the puzzle that revealed systematic discrimination rather than isolated incidents. Internal emails discussed loss prevention strategies that clearly profiled customers based on race and ethnicity. Training materials included coded language that encouraged employees to pay special attention to high-risk demographics. "This goes all the way to the top," Davis continued, his voice heavy with the weight of evidence. "Megamart's corporate leadership created an environment that not only tolerated discrimination but actively encouraged it under the guise of theft prevention." Theodore studied the documents with the same careful attention he brought to analyzing fire scenes, seeing patterns and connections that painted a damning picture of institutional bias. "How did you get access to these internal documents?" "Once we filed the lawsuit, we were entitled to discovery. Megamart fought us every step of the way, but the court ordered them to produce these materials. What they revealed was worse than we initially suspected." Davis reached for another folder, this one containing financial records and corporate communications. The company's own data shows that stores in predominantly minority neighborhoods had significantly higher rates of customer confrontations and trespassing orders, despite similar theft rates across all locations. The pattern is so clear that it can only be explained by systematic discrimination. The scope of the evidence was overwhelming, transforming Theodore's personal experience into part of a much larger civil rights violation. He thought about all the people who had suffered similar humiliation without the benefit of viral video footage or public support. "What are you asking of me, Mr. Davis?" The attorney's expression grew more serious as he prepared to outline the path forward. "Chief Washington, I'm asking you to be the lead plaintiff in a class action lawsuit against Megamart Corporation. Your case has the elements we need: clear evidence of discrimination, a sympathetic plaintiff with impeccable character, and video documentation that makes denial impossible." Theodore felt the weight of unwanted leadership settling on his shoulders once again. What would that involve? Depositions, court appearances, media attention, and a level of scrutiny of your personal life that will be uncomfortable. But it would also mean justice not just for you, but for everyone who has been treated the way you were treated. The lawyer paused, allowing the magnitude of the decision to sink in before continuing. "The potential damages in a case like this could be substantial, not just for you personally, but for all the affected customers. More importantly, we can demand changes in corporate policy that will prevent this from happening to others." Theodore looked out the office window at the city sprawling below, thinking about all the families he had served during his career as a firefighter. He had never hesitated to risk his life to protect others, but this felt different, more complex and politically charged than the clear moral choices he faced at fire scenes. "I need to think about this," Theodore said finally. "Can you give me some time?" "Of course, but I should tell you that Megamart's legal team has already reached out about a settlement. They want to resolve this quietly, without admitting wrongdoing and without the kind of public trial that would expose their discriminatory practices." Theodore's eyes sharpened with interest and suspicion. "What kind of settlement?" Davis pulled out a single sheet of paper from another folder. "A significant monetary settlement for you personally, a confidentiality agreement that would prevent you from discussing the case publicly, and no admission of wrongdoing by the company." "In other words, they want to buy my silence." "Essentially, yes. It's a common tactic. Pay enough money to make the problem go away without accepting responsibility or making changes that would prevent future discrimination." Theodore felt a surge of anger at the corporate cynicism revealed by the settlement offer. The company was willing to pay him handsomely to stay quiet while continuing to humiliate and discriminate against other customers who lacked his platform and visibility. "What happens if I reject the settlement and pursue the class action?" Davis leaned back in his chair, his expression reflecting both the challenges and opportunities of the case. "It means a long legal battle, probably 2 to 3 years of litigation, intense media scrutiny, and no guarantee of the outcome. But it also means the possibility of real change, not just for you, but for everyone who shops in their stores." The choice before Theodore was stark and difficult. He could accept the settlement, take care of his family's financial future, and return to the quiet life he preferred. Or he could endure years of legal proceedings and public attention in pursuit of justice for people he would never meet. Before Theodore could respond, Davis's secretary knocked and entered the office. "Mr. Davis, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a call I think Chief Washington should know about. It's from Isaiah Brown, the security guard from Megamart." Theodore looked up with surprise and interest. "What does he want?" The secretary glanced between the two men nervously. "He says he has information about the company's discriminatory practices that could be important to the case. He sounds upset and wants to meet as soon as possible." Davis and Theodore exchanged meaningful glances, both recognizing the potential significance of testimony from someone inside the company's security apparatus. "Tell him we can meet this afternoon," Davis instructed. As the secretary left to arrange the meeting, Theodore felt the complexity of his situation deepening. What had begun as a simple shopping trip for batteries had evolved into a potential landmark civil rights case with implications far beyond his personal experience. "Chief Washington," Davis said, his tone reflecting the gravity of the moment, "I want you to know that whatever you decide, I respect your choice. This kind of case requires enormous personal sacrifice, and no one should be forced to become a symbol against their will." Theodore nodded, appreciating the lawyer's understanding of his dilemma. But as he thought about his grandson and the world the boy would inherit, he began to feel the pull of a different kind of service than he had ever provided as a firefighter. "Mr. Davis, if we go forward with this case, what changes could we realistically achieve?" The attorney's eyes lit up with the passion that had driven his career in civil rights law. "We could force Megamart to completely overhaul their security policies, implement bias training for all employees, establish an independent monitoring system for customer complaints, and pay significant damages that would make discrimination financially costly rather than profitable." Theodore absorbed the possibilities, understanding that his decision would ripple far beyond his own life. He thought about Keandra Johnson and the courage she had shown in coming forward. He thought about the 17 other victims who had contacted Davis's office. Most of all, he thought about the unknown number of people who had suffered in silence, their dignity stripped away by systematic discrimination disguised as loss prevention. The meeting with Isaiah Brown would provide crucial information about the company's practices, but Theodore already felt his resolve hardening into determination. He had spent his career running toward danger when others ran away from it. Perhaps it was time to run toward a different kind of fire, the one that burned away justice and human dignity in the name of corporate profit. Outside the law office windows, Atlanta stretched toward the horizon, a city built on the promise of progress and equality. Theodore Washington was about to test whether that promise extended to men like him, and whether justice was still possible in a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. The real fight was about to begin. The coffee shop on Peachtree Street hummed with the familiar rhythms of urban life, laptops clicking, conversations flowing, and the steady hiss of espresso machines creating a soundtrack of productivity and community. Theodore arrived early, choosing a corner table that offered privacy while allowing him to observe the entrance. His years of emergency response had taught him to assess environments instinctively, and the habit persisted even in civilian settings. Isaiah Brown entered 10 minutes later, his young face drawn with stress and his movements betraying the nervous energy of someone about to cross a line from which there was no return. At 23, Isaiah carried himself with the uncertainty of someone still discovering his place in the world, but his eyes held a determination that belied his youth. Theodore stood as Isaiah approached, offering his hand in greeting. The young man's handshake was firm, but trembling slightly, evidence of the internal struggle that had brought him to this moment. "Mr. Brown," Theodore said gently, "thank you for reaching out. I know this can't be easy for you." Isaiah settled into the chair across from Theodore, his uniform from his new job at a different security company, a reminder of how quickly his world had changed since the Megamart incident. "Chief Washington, I need to tell you things about that company that you need to know. Things that show what happened to you wasn't an accident." The young man's voice carried the weight of conscience finally freed from the constraints of economic necessity and misplaced loyalty. Since leaving Megamart, Isaiah had found work with a private security firm that treated its employees with respect and trained them to de-escalate rather than confront. "Take your time," Theodore encouraged, recognizing the courage it took for someone Isaiah's age to speak out against a former employer. "Tell me what you think I should know." Isaiah pulled a manila folder from his backpack, glancing around nervously before opening it on the table between them. "I've been working security for 3 years, and I've seen this pattern at multiple stores. What happened to you happens all the time, but nobody talks about it because the victims usually just leave and don't come back." Inside the folder were printed emails, training materials, and incident reports that Isaiah had carefully copied during his final weeks at Megamart. The documents painted a picture of systematic discrimination dressed up as loss prevention strategy. "Look at this," Isaiah said, pointing to an email from district management. "They call it Enhanced Observation Protocols. But what it really means is profiling customers based on race and appearance." Theodore studied the document, his anger building as he read the coded language that encouraged employees to pay special attention to customers who fit certain demographic profiles. The corporate doublespeak was transparent in its intent, creating plausible deniability while encouraging discriminatory behavior. "This training manual is even worse," Isaiah continued, pulling out a thick booklet marked Confidential Loss Prevention Guidelines. "It teaches security guards to identify high-risk customers using criteria that are clearly racial profiling, though they never say it directly." The manual contained photographs and descriptions that left no doubt about its discriminatory intent. Suspicious behaviors included taking time to examine merchandise, asking questions about products, and moving slowly through aisles, normal shopping activities that became grounds for suspicion when performed by minorities. Theodore felt his professional investigative instincts engaging as he absorbed the evidence. "Isaiah, how widespread was this training? Did all security personnel receive these materials?" "Everyone," Isaiah replied without hesitation. New employees got a week of training that was supposedly about theft prevention, but was really about profiling customers. They showed us videos of suspicious behavior that were obviously targeting minorities. The young man's voice grew stronger as he continued, the relief of finally speaking truth overriding his nervousness. The worst part was the quota system. We were expected to make a certain number of customer stops each month, and if you didn't meet the numbers, your performance evaluation suffered. Theodore's eyebrows rose with surprise and disgust. They had quotas for harassing customers? They called them customer interactions, but yeah, basically quotas for confronting people. And the only way to meet the numbers was to target minorities because management wouldn't back you up if you stopped white customers without clear evidence of actual theft. The revelation transformed Theodore's understanding of what had happened to him from an isolated incident of prejudice to a calculated business strategy designed to intimidate and exclude minority customers. The systematic nature of the discrimination was breathtaking in its scope and cynicism. Isaiah, this is incredibly damaging evidence against Megamart. Why are you willing to share it with me? The young man was quiet for a moment, his gaze focused on the coffee cup in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes reflected a moral clarity that reminded Theodore of his younger self. Because what happened to you was wrong, and because I was part of it even though I didn't want to be. I needed that job to pay for college, and I told myself I was just following orders. But watching you stand up to Hoffman that day, seeing your dignity in the face of that harassment, it made me realize I couldn't stay silent anymore. Theodore felt a surge of respect for Isaiah's courage, recognizing in the young man the same moral conviction that had driven him to become a firefighter. What consequences are you facing by coming forward? I could be sued for violating confidentiality agreements. I could be blacklisted from security work, but I can't live with staying quiet when I have evidence that could help prevent this from happening to other people. The sacrifice Isaiah was making struck Theodore powerfully. Here was a young man risking his career and financial stability to do what was right, asking nothing in return except the knowledge that his conscience was clear. There's something else, Isaiah continued, reaching deeper into his folder. I documented specific incidents where customers were harassed using these protocols. Names, dates, descriptions of what happened. Some of the incidents were worse than what happened to you. He pulled out a handwritten notebook filled with careful observations and incident reports that Isaiah had compiled during his time at Megamart. Each entry detailed discriminatory encounters with customers, creating a comprehensive record of systematic harassment. I started keeping this record after I saw Hoffman make an elderly black woman cry because he accused her of stealing candy for her grandchildren. She was so humiliated that she left without buying anything, and I realized that if I didn't document what was happening, nobody would ever know. Theodore flipped through the notebook, reading entry after entry of discrimination disguised as security enforcement. The patterns were clear and consistent. Minorities were confronted, questioned, and humiliated at rates far exceeding their representation among actual shoplifters. Isaiah, this evidence could be crucial to the lawsuit I'm considering. Are you prepared to testify in court about what you witnessed? The young man nodded without hesitation. I'm ready to testify. I know it won't be easy, but people need to know what's really happening in these stores. Theodore closed the notebook, feeling the weight of evidence that transformed his case from a single incident to a comprehensive indictment of corporate discrimination. I want you to know how much I appreciate your courage in coming forward. This can't be easy for you. It's easier than staying silent, Isaiah replied, echoing Keandra Johnson's words from their earlier conversation. My grandmother used to tell me that good people have an obligation to speak up when they see wrong being done. I should have spoken up sooner. As their conversation continued, Theodore learned more about the internal culture at Megamart that enabled and encouraged discriminatory behavior. Managers were rewarded for low theft numbers regardless of how they achieved them. Employees who questioned profiling practices were marginalized or terminated. Corporate headquarters maintained plausible deniability while creating incentives for discrimination. The company knows exactly what's happening, Isaiah explained. They get reports on every customer interaction, every trespassing order, every complaint. The patterns are obvious if you look at the data, but they choose to ignore it because it helps their profit margins. Theodore thought about the settlement offer Davis had mentioned, understanding now why Megamart was eager to resolve his case quietly. The evidence Isaiah was providing would expose not just individual misconduct, but systematic corporate discrimination that could result in massive liability. Isaiah, I'm going to be honest with you about what testifying in this case could mean. The company's lawyers will try to discredit you, question your motives, and make your life difficult. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny? The young man's expression hardened with resolve. Chief Washington, you walked into a burning building to save strangers. The least I can do is walk into a courtroom to tell the truth. The comparison struck Theodore deeply, highlighting the different forms of courage required by different circumstances. Isaiah's willingness to sacrifice his own interests for the sake of justice represented the same spirit of service that had defined Theodore's career as a firefighter. As their meeting concluded, Theodore felt the last of his reluctance about pursuing the lawsuit dissolving. The evidence Isaiah provided, combined with the testimonies of other victims and the corporate documents Davis had obtained, created a compelling case for systematic discrimination that demanded legal accountability. Isaiah, I want you to meet with my attorney as soon as possible. This evidence needs to be properly documented and preserved. I'll do whatever you need, Isaiah replied, standing and offering his hand again. Thank you for having the courage to fight this, Chief Washington. A lot of people are counting on you, even if they don't know it yet. As Theodore watched Isaiah walk away, he reflected on the young man's transformation from reluctant participant in discrimination to courageous whistleblower. The change reminded him of his own evolution from victim of harassment to potential champion of civil rights, roles he had never sought but found himself compelled to embrace. The coffee shop continued its normal rhythms around him, but Theodore knew that nothing would ever be normal for him again. The evidence in Isaiah's folder would change everything, transforming his personal grievance into a weapon for justice that could protect countless future victims of discrimination. The fire of injustice that had started with a simple shopping trip was about to become a conflagration that would consume Megamart's discriminatory practices and light the way toward meaningful change. Theodore Washington was ready to fan those flames, no matter the personal cost. The law offices of Coleman, Hayes, and Associates had been transformed into a battlefield disguised as a conference room. Megamart's legal team occupied one side of the massive mahogany table like an army in expensive suits, their briefcases and documents arranged with military precision. Across from them sat Theodore Washington, flanked by Tyrone Davis and his associate attorneys, their more modest presentation belying the strength of their case. The room itself seemed to reflect the stakes of the confrontation, floor-to-ceiling law books, oil paintings of distinguished jurists, and windows overlooking the city where the outcome of this legal battle would ripple through communities for years to come. The air conditioning hummed steadily, but tension filled the space like humidity before a summer storm. Richard Sterling, Megamart's lead attorney, was a man whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered. At 58, he had spent 3 decades defending corporations against discrimination claims, and his track record of victories had made him wealthy beyond most people's dreams. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit hand-tailored, and his manner calculated to intimidate opposing parties into submission. "Mr. Washington," Sterling began, his voice carrying the cultured authority of someone educated at Ivy League institutions and accustomed to deference. "I want to thank you for making time for this deposition. I know your schedule as a fire chief must be quite demanding." Theodore recognized the false courtesy for what it was, a prelude to attack disguised as politeness. He had seen similar tactics from hostile witnesses during fire investigations, people who smiled while concealing crucial information that could save lives. "I'm here to tell the truth about what happened to me," Theodore replied simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had sustained him through decades of command decisions. Sterling's smile was sharp as a blade. "Of course, truth is what we're all seeking here." He opened a thick folder and pulled out a document. "Mr. Washington, I'd like to begin by establishing some background information about your character and credibility." Tyrone Davis leaned forward slightly, his antennae alert to the direction of Sterling's questioning. The opening moments of a deposition often revealed the defense strategy, and Sterling's focus on character suggested an attempt to undermine Theodore's credibility rather than address the facts of the case. "Mr. Washington, isn't it true that you have a history of confrontational behavior with authority figures?" Sterling asked, consulting notes that had obviously been prepared through extensive investigation. Theodore felt anger flash through him but kept his expression neutral. "Could you be more specific about what you mean by confrontational behavior?" Sterling pulled out another document. "According to department records, you filed formal complaints against 3 different supervisors during your career. Doesn't that suggest a pattern of insubordination?" Davis started to object, but Theodore held up a hand to indicate he would answer the question. "I filed complaints when I witnessed safety violations that put my crew or the public at risk. That's not insubordination. That's leadership and moral responsibility. But you questioned the judgment of your superiors on multiple occasions." Sterling pressed, his tone suggesting that such behavior was inherently suspicious. "When lives were at stake, yes, I would do it again without hesitation." Sterling made a note, his expression suggesting that Theodore's answer played into some larger strategy. "Mr. Washington, on the day of the incident at Megamart, had you consumed any alcohol or controlled substances that might have affected your judgment?" The question was so absurd that Theodore almost laughed. "I was on duty earlier that day and subject to random drug testing as a condition of my employment. I had consumed nothing but coffee." "But you admit that you were stressed about personal matters that might have made you more confrontational than usual?" Theodore's eyes narrowed as he recognized the trap Sterling was trying to set. "What personal matters are you referring to?" Sterling consulted his notes with theatrical precision. "Your wife died 3 years ago from cancer. You've been raising your grandson largely alone while managing the demands of a high-stress job. Isn't it possible that these pressures made you more likely to overreact to what might have been a routine security inquiry?" The attack on his personal life struck Theodore like a physical blow. Bringing his wife's death and his family responsibilities into the deposition was not just legally questionable but morally reprehensible. He could see Davis preparing to object, but Theodore's response came from a place of controlled fury. "Mr. Sterling, my wife's death taught me the value of dignity and respect in human interactions. Her memory motivates me to stand up against injustice, not to create confrontations where none exist." Davis finally interjected, his voice sharp with professional outrage. "Objection. Counselor's questions about the deponent's personal tragedy are irrelevant and designed solely to harass." Sterling waved dismissively. "I'm establishing the witness's state of mind and potential motivations for misinterpreting normal security procedures." Theodore leaned forward slightly, his composure intact despite the personal attack. "Mr. Sterling, there was nothing normal about being accused of theft for examining batteries I intended to purchase. There was nothing normal about being physically restrained without cause. And there was nothing normal about being trespassed from a store for asking reasonable questions." The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing every word of the increasingly tense exchange. Sterling consulted his notes again, clearly following a prepared script designed to undermine Theodore's credibility through character assassination. Mr. Washington, isn't it true that you have a history of filing complaints against businesses for alleged discrimination? Theodore's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. What complaints are you referring to? Sterling produced another document with theatrical flourish. In 2018, you filed a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission against a restaurant that you claimed provided inferior service based on your race. That's not accurate, Theodore replied firmly. I filed a complaint with the city's Human Rights Commission after a restaurant refused to seat my family despite having empty tables, and then lied about their reservation policy. The complaint was investigated and sustained. But you sought monetary compensation, didn't you? I sought an apology and changes in their seating practices to prevent other families from experiencing the same treatment. I received no monetary compensation. Sterling's strategy was becoming clear. Paint Theodore as a serial complainant who manufactured discrimination claims for financial gain. But Theodore's calm responses and factual corrections were undermining the attack, while revealing the attorney's reliance on distorted information. Mr. Washington, on the day of the Megamart incident, weren't you carrying a large amount of cash that might have made store personnel suspicious? Theodore almost smiled at the absurdity of the question. I had $43 in my wallet, Mr. Sterling. Hardly a suspicious amount. But you were dressed casually, not in your fire department uniform. How was store personnel supposed to know you were a respected public servant? The question revealed the underlying prejudice that Sterling was trying to normalize. Davis leaned forward to object, but Theodore's response came swiftly. Mr. Sterling, are you suggesting that people deserve respect only when wearing uniforms that identify their occupations? That civilians have less right to dignity than uniformed personnel? Sterling's face flushed slightly as he realized the trap he had walked into. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm simply pointing out that first impressions matter in security situations. Indeed, they do, Theodore agreed. And the first impression your client's manager formed was based entirely on the color of my skin, not my behavior or appearance. The deposition continued for 6 hours, with Sterling attempting various strategies to undermine Theodore's credibility while avoiding the substantial evidence of systematic discrimination. He questioned Theodore's memory of events, suggested he had misinterpreted normal security procedures, and implied that his civil rights lawsuit was motivated by financial greed rather than justice. But Theodore's responses remained consistent and compelling. His years of testifying at fire investigations had prepared him for hostile questioning, and his natural dignity made Sterling's attack seem increasingly desperate and inappropriate. Mr. Washington, Sterling said during the final hour of questioning, if Megamart were to offer a substantial financial settlement to resolve this matter quietly, would you consider accepting it? Davis started to object to the question as improper, but Theodore held up a hand. Mr. Sterling, no amount of money would compensate for the humiliation I experienced or prevent other customers from facing the same treatment. This case isn't about money, it's about accountability and change. Sterling's expression showed frustration as his final gambit failed. But surely you recognize that litigation is expensive and time-consuming for all parties. Wouldn't a settlement be more practical? What's practical, Theodore replied with quiet intensity, is creating a system where citizens can shop for batteries without being treated like criminals because of their race. What's practical is holding corporations accountable for discriminatory practices that harm countless innocent people. As the deposition concluded, Sterling packed his documents with obvious displeasure while Theodore sat calmly, his composure intact despite 6 hours of character assassination attempts. The court reporter gathered her equipment, and the various attorneys began their ritual of post-deposition positioning. "Chief Washington," Sterling said as he prepared to leave, "I hope you understand that this deposition will be thoroughly analyzed, and any inconsistencies in your testimony will be highlighted at trial." Theodore stood and extended his hand with professional courtesy. "Mr. Sterling, I welcome that analysis. The truth doesn't change with a petition or scrutiny." After Megamart's legal team departed, Davis and Theodore remained in the conference room, reviewing the day's proceedings and planning their next moves. The deposition had revealed Megamart's strategy: attack Theodore's character while avoiding discussion of the systematic discrimination evidence. "How do you think it went?" Theodore asked, settling back into his chair with obvious fatigue. Davis smiled with satisfaction. "Sterling tried every trick in the book to discredit you, and you handled each attack with grace and intelligence. His questions revealed more about their desperation than they did about any weakness in our case. He really went after my personal life." "He did, and it backfired. Bringing up your wife's death and suggesting it made you unstable showed the jury pool, if they see the deposition footage, exactly what kind of people they're dealing with." Theodore nodded thoughtfully. "What happens next?" "We prepare for Megamart's corporate representative deposition. Now that we've seen their strategy, we can anticipate their defenses and prepare our responses accordingly." As Theodore left the law offices that evening, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from a simple shopping trip to a legal battle with national implications. The deposition had been grueling, but it had also strengthened his resolve to see the case through to completion. The corporate lawyers could attack his character and question his motives, but they couldn't change the fundamental facts of what had happened or the evidence of systematic discrimination that Isaiah Brown and other witnesses had provided. Justice might be slow and painful, but it was still possible for those with the courage to pursue it. The real fight was far from over, but Theodore Washington was more determined than ever to see it through to victory. The Megamart corporate headquarters occupied a gleaming steel and glass tower in suburban Dallas. Its imposing presence designed to project power and success rather than accessibility or warmth. Inside the building's executive conference room, another battle in the legal war was about to unfold, this time with Theodore's legal team on the offensive and Megamart's leadership forced to defend their company's discriminatory practices under oath. David Hoffman sat at the defendant's table, no longer the confident store manager who had harassed Theodore with impunity. 3 months of negative publicity, internal investigations, and legal scrutiny had transformed him into a nervous, diminished figure whose career and reputation lay in ruins. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed his prepared statements, and his face had the pallor of someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. Across from him sat Regional Vice President Patricia Manning, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, whose climb up the corporate ladder had been built on ruthless efficiency and willingness to implement policies that maximized profit regardless of ethical considerations. Manning's expression revealed nothing, but her rigid posture suggested someone prepared for battle. Tyrone Davis had flown to Dallas with a team of associates and investigators, their presence in the Megamart boardroom a clear signal that the company's discriminatory practices would face comprehensive legal scrutiny. Davis's reputation had preceded him into the room, and even Megamart's high-powered legal team seemed wary of his methodical approach to exposing corporate wrongdoing. "Miss Manning," Davis began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him one of the nation's most feared civil rights attorneys. "You are the regional vice president for loss prevention across Megamart's southeastern stores. Is that correct?" Manning leaned forward to speak into the microphone, her voice crisp and professional. "That is correct. I oversee security operations for 847 stores across 12 states. And in that capacity, you are responsible for developing and implementing the policies that govern how customers are treated in Megamart stores?" "I oversee loss prevention strategies." "Yes. Customer treatment policies are developed by multiple departments working in coordination." Davis pulled out a thick folder of documents, the evidence gathered through months of investigation and discovery. "Miss Manning, are you familiar with the enhanced observation protocol that was implemented in your region in 2019? Manning's attorney, James Crawford, leaned forward with obvious concern. Crawford was Megamart's general counsel, a man whose job was to minimize the company's legal exposure while maintaining plausible deniability for discriminatory practices. "Could you be more specific about which protocol you're referring to?" Manning replied, her tone suggesting careful preparation for this line of questioning. Davis produced a document marked with Megamart's corporate seal. "This memorandum, sent from your office to all store managers in March 2019, implementing what it calls enhanced observation protocols for high-risk customer demographics. Are you familiar with this document?" Manning's composure cracked slightly as she recognized the memorandum that she had personally authored. "I recall that document, yes." "Could you read the third paragraph for the record, please?" Manning's voice became strained as she read her own words. "Store personnel should pay particular attention to customers who exhibit behaviors consistent with theft risk profiles, including prolonged examination of merchandise, slow movement through aisles, and demographic indicators associated with higher loss rates." "Manning, what did you mean by demographic indicators associated with higher loss rates?" Crawford started to object, but Manning was already answering. "We used statistical analysis to identify customer patterns that correlated with inventory losses." "And what demographics did your analysis identify as high risk?" Manning's face had gone pale as she realized the trap Davis had set. Any honest answer would admit to racial profiling, while evasion would suggest consciousness of guilt. "The analysis looked at various factors," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Davis pulled out another document. "Miss Manning, this is the statistical analysis referenced in your memorandum. According to this data, 73% of customer stops under your enhanced observation protocol involved African American customers, despite African Americans representing only 31% of your customer base in the affected markets. How do you explain this disparity?" The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Manning looked desperately at Crawford, who could only shake his head slightly in warning against answering. "I would need to review the specific methodology of that analysis before commenting," Manning said, but her evasion sounded hollow even to her own ears. Davis turned his attention to David Hoffman, whose nervousness had increased visibly during Manning's testimony. "Mr. Hoffman, you were the store manager at the Megamart location where Chief Washington was harassed, is that correct?" Hoffman cleared his throat nervously. "I was the assistant manager at that location, yes. And you received training on the enhanced observation protocol described by Miss Manning?" "I received training on loss prevention procedures, yes." Davis produced a video recording device. "Mr. Hoffman, this is footage from the training session you attended on implementing the enhanced observation protocol. Would you like to review it before we discuss its contents? Hoffman's face went ashen as he recognized the implications of video evidence. I don't think that's necessary. The training video shows you asking specifically about how to identify suspicious customers without violating civil rights laws. Do you remember asking that question? I may have asked about legal guidelines, yes. And do you remember the instructor's response? He said, and I quote from the transcript, "You can't profile based on race directly, but you can use behavioral indicators that happen to correlate with certain demographics." Do you recall that response? Hoffman's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but the damage was already done. The corporate training had essentially taught employees how to engage in racial profiling while maintaining legal cover. Mr. Hoffman, when you approached Chief Washington in your store, what specific behaviors had you observed that you considered suspicious? Hoffman struggled to find words that wouldn't damn him further. He was spending a long time examining merchandise without making purchases. How long is too long to examine merchandise before it becomes suspicious, Mr. Hoffman? I don't have a specific time frame. Was 15 minutes too long? 20 minutes? An hour? It depends on the circumstances. Davis leaned forward intently. Mr. Hoffman, Chief Washington had been in your store for approximately 17 minutes when you confronted him. Is 17 minutes an unusually long time for a customer to spend shopping? Not necessarily, no. Then why did you consider his behavior suspicious? Hoffman's silence was damning. Any honest answer would admit to racial profiling, while continued evasion would make his guilt obvious to any jury. Mr. Hoffman, in your 3 years as assistant manager, how many white customers did you personally confront for suspicious behavior that consisted solely of examining merchandise? Crawford objected strenuously, but Davis pressed on. According to store records obtained through discovery, you personally initiated customer confrontations 127 times during your tenure. Of those confrontations, 89% involved minority customers. How do you explain this pattern? The statistical evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Hoffman's protestations about random security checks crumbled in the face of data that revealed systematic discrimination disguised as loss prevention. Mr. Hoffman, when Chief Washington asked you why he was being questioned, you refused to provide a clear answer. Why? I explained that he was acting suspicious. But when he asked what specific actions were suspicious, you couldn't identify any illegal behavior, could you? I was concerned about potential theft. Based on what evidence? Hoffman's silence stretched uncomfortably as he realized that any honest answer would expose the racial profiling that motivated his actions. Davis had systematically demolished every justification Megamart had offered for their discriminatory practices. The deposition continued for 8 hours, with Davis methodically exposing the company's systematic discrimination through internal documents, training materials, and statistical evidence. Manning and Hoffman's testimony revealed a corporate culture that encouraged racial profiling while maintaining plausible deniability through careful language and indirect instructions. By the end of the day, Megamart's legal position had been severely damaged. Their executives had been forced to admit to policies that disproportionately targeted minority customers, training programs that taught employees to engage in discrimination, and statistical patterns that revealed systematic bias. As the deposition concluded, Crawford approached Davis with obvious concern. "Counselor, perhaps we should discuss settlement possibilities more seriously." Davis smiled coldly. "Mr. Crawford, after today's testimony, the settlement terms have changed significantly. Your company's liability exposure has increased dramatically." The corporate depositions had achieved exactly what Davis had hoped, forcing Megamart's leadership to admit under oath to the discriminatory practices that had made Theodore's harassment inevitable rather than accidental. The evidence was now overwhelming and undeniable. As Davis flew back to Atlanta that evening, he reflected on the power of systematic legal discovery to expose corporate wrongdoing. Megamart's executives had tried to hide behind euphemisms and statistics, but their own words and policies had condemned them more effectively than any outside accusation. The legal battle was far from over, but the corporate depositions had shifted the momentum decisively in Theodore's favor. Justice was still a long fight away, but it was no longer a distant hope. The federal courthouse in Atlanta stood as a monument to the promise of equal justice, its neoclassical columns and marble steps representing the ideals that the American legal system aspired to uphold. On a crisp October morning, those steps were crowded with reporters, activists, and curious citizens drawn by a case that had captured national attention and embodied the ongoing struggle for civil rights in modern America. Theodore Washington walked up those steps with quiet dignity, flanked by his legal team and surrounded by a crowd of supporters who had traveled from across the country to witness what many hoped would be a landmark victory against corporate discrimination. He wore his dress uniform, the ribbons and badges reflecting decades of service to his community, but his expression showed the weight of unwanted celebrity and the burden of representing something larger than himself. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on closed-circuit television in adjacent rooms. Federal Judge Margaret Stevens, a 60-year-old African-American woman with a reputation for fairness and intellectual rigor, presided over proceedings with the gravity befitting a case with national implications. The jury selection had taken 3 days, with both sides seeking panelists who could evaluate evidence objectively, despite the media attention and political overtones surrounding the case. The final panel reflected the diversity of American society, 8 women and 4 men, representing various racial and ethnic backgrounds, ages, and professional experiences. Tyrone Davis rose to deliver his opening statement, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the packed courtroom. He had prepared for this moment throughout his career, understanding that some cases transcend individual grievances to become vehicles for broader social change. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Davis began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "This case is about dignity. It's about the right of every American citizen to shop for batteries without being treated like a criminal because of the color of their skin." He gestured toward Theodore, whose bearing reflected the quiet strength that had sustained him through months of legal proceedings and public scrutiny. Chief Washington didn't choose to become a symbol. He simply refused to accept humiliation when confronted by systematic discrimination disguised as security policy. Davis moved closer to the jury box, his tone becoming more personal and urgent. "Over the next 2 weeks, you will hear evidence that Megamart Corporation created and implemented policies designed to target minority customers for harassment. You will see internal documents, training materials, and statistical data that reveal a pattern of discrimination affecting thousands of innocent Americans." Standing beside a rescue truck, you will learn about a man who has spent 23 years risking his life to protect others, regardless of their race, religion, or economic status. A man who has rescued children from burning buildings, pulled victims from car wrecks, and led emergency responses during natural disasters. Davis's voice rose with controlled emotion, and you will hear how this same man was denied the basic respect and dignity that every American deserves when he tried to buy batteries for his grandson's toy. The opening statement continued for 45 minutes, with Davis methodically outlining the evidence that would prove Megamart's systematic discrimination. He described Isaiah Brown's courageous testimony, Keandra Johnson's eyewitness account, and the statistical analysis that revealed discriminatory patterns across multiple store locations. This case isn't about one bad decision by one store manager, Davis concluded, returning to stand directly in front of the jury. It's about a corporate culture that profits from prejudice and hides behind euphemisms while denying dignity to customers who don't fit their preferred demographic profile. As Davis returned to his seat, the courtroom remained silent, the weight of his words settling over the packed gallery like morning fog. Theodore sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, knowing that his fate now rested in the hands of 12 strangers who would determine whether justice was still possible in America. Richard Sterling rose for Megamart's opening statement, his expensive suit and polished demeanor projecting corporate power and legal sophistication. He had spent 3 decades defending discrimination cases, and his strategy relied on confusion, misdirection, and character assassination rather than addressing the evidence directly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling began, his tone suggesting that Davis's emotional appeal was beneath the dignity of serious legal proceedings. "What you've just heard was a compelling story, but stories are not evidence. Evidence is what we examine in courtrooms, not emotional manipulation designed to cloud your judgment." Sterling approached the jury with calculated confidence. Megamart Corporation operates 3,247 stores across America, serving millions of customers annually without incident. The unfortunate encounter involving Mr. Washington was an isolated incident involving employee error, not corporate policy. The defense attorney produced a chart showing Megamart's employment statistics. This company employs over 47,000 people nationwide, including thousands of minority employees at every level of management. Does this sound like a company driven by racial prejudice? Sterling's strategy was becoming clear. Acknowledge the incident while denying systematic discrimination, portray Megamart as a responsible corporate citizen, and suggest that Theodore had overreacted to normal security procedures. "Mr. Washington is undoubtedly a fine public servant," Sterling continued, "but being a fire chief doesn't grant immunity from routine security inquiries. Store personnel have both the right and responsibility to investigate suspicious behavior, regardless of a customer's occupation or social standing." The corporate lawyer spent considerable time describing Megamart's community involvement, charitable contributions, and diversity initiatives. He painted a picture of a company committed to equality and inclusion, suggesting that any discriminatory incidents were aberrations rather than policy. "The plaintiff's attorneys will show you statistics that seem to support their claims," Sterling warned the jury. "But statistics can be manipulated to support any argument. Context matters, and the context here is a retail environment where theft prevention is a legitimate business concern." Sterling's opening lasted an hour, during which he systematically attempted to undermine every aspect of Davis's case while avoiding direct discussion of the most damaging evidence. He questioned Theodore's credibility, suggested that employee training materials were taken out of context, and argued that statistical disparities could be explained by factors other than discrimination. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling concluded, "Megamart Corporation made mistakes in handling Mr. Washington's situation, but mistakes are not crimes. Good companies learn from their errors and improve their procedures. That's exactly what Megamart has done in response to this unfortunate incident." As Sterling returned to his seat, the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as observers debated the effectiveness of both opening statements. Judge Stevens called for order and instructed Davis to call his first witness. "Your Honor," The plaintiff calls Theodore Washington to the stand. Theodore stood slowly, straightening his uniform jacket before walking to the witness stand. The courtroom fell silent as he was sworn in, his right hand raised and his voice clear as he promised to tell the truth. Every eye in the packed gallery focused on this moment when the victim would tell his story in his own words. Davis approached the witness stand with respect and gentle encouragement. "Chief Washington, please tell the jury what happened on the afternoon you went to Megamart to shop for batteries." Theodore's testimony was measured and precise, describing his shopping experience with the careful attention to detail that characterized his professional reports. He recounted approaching the battery display, examining different options for his grandson's toy, and being confronted by David Hoffman without warning or justification. The manager demanded to see identification and a receipt for purchases I hadn't made yet, Theodore testified, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. When I asked why he was questioning me, he became aggressive and accused me of suspicious behavior. Davis guided Theodore through each moment of the encounter, from the initial confrontation to the arrival of police and his eventual ejection from the store. Theodore's dignity remained intact as he described the humiliation, his voice never rising but carrying an emotional weight that reached every member of the jury. "Chief Washington," Davis asked, "how did this experience affect you personally?" Theodore was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving across the courtroom before settling back on Davis. "It reminded me that no matter how much I've accomplished or how many lives I've saved, there are still people who see only my race when they look at me. That's a painful reality for any American to face." The testimony continued for 2 hours, with Theodore answering questions about his career, his character, and his motivations for pursuing the lawsuit. His responses were consistent with his deposition testimony, revealing a man motivated by justice rather than financial gain. Sterling's cross-examination was aggressive but ultimately ineffective. Despite hours of hostile questioning, Theodore's story remained unchanged and his credibility intact. Sterling's attempts to portray him as oversensitive or confrontational fell flat in the face of his obvious dignity and professional accomplishments. As the first day of trial concluded, the courtroom slowly emptied with spectators discussing what they had witnessed. Theodore remained at the plaintiff's table for several minutes, his mind processing the strange experience of having his most humiliating moment dissected in public. Davis placed a hand on his client's shoulder. "You did well today, Chief. Your testimony was powerful and credible." Theodore nodded, but his expression reflected the emotional cost of reliving the harassment in front of a packed courtroom. "How many more days of this, Tyrone?" "As many as it takes to get justice," Davis replied, "but we're off to a strong start." Outside the courthouse, the media circus continued as reporters analyzed the day's proceedings and speculated about the trial's outcome. Theodore avoided the cameras, slipping out a side entrance to escape the attention that had transformed his private pain into public spectacle. The trial was just beginning, but the foundation had been laid for a legal battle that would determine whether corporate America could be held accountable for systematic discrimination or whether profitable prejudice would continue to hide behind euphemisms and legal technicalities. Justice was still many days away, but it had begun to seem possible. 3 weeks of testimony had transformed the federal courthouse into the epicenter of a national conversation about race, dignity, and corporate accountability. The evidence presented by Tyrone Davis and his legal team had been overwhelming. Internal documents revealing discriminatory policies, statistical analysis showing racial bias in customer confrontations, and witness testimony from Isaiah Brown, Keandra Johnson, and 17 other victims of similar harassment. Megamart's defense had crumbled under the weight of evidence, with their own executives forced to admit under oath to implementing policies that disproportionately targeted minority customers. Richard Sterling's attempts to portray the discrimination as isolated incidents had been systematically dismantled by data showing patterns across multiple states and hundreds of store locations. The jury deliberation lasted 18 hours across 3 days, during which time the courthouse remained surrounded by protesters, supporters, and media representatives, waiting for a verdict that would ripple across corporate America. Theodore spent those days at home, trying to maintain normal routines while knowing that his life would never truly be normal again. When the call came that the jury had reached a verdict, Theodore arrived at the courthouse to find the largest crowd yet assembled on the marble steps. He walked through a corridor of supporters whose faces reflected hope, determination, and the weight of generations of struggle for equal treatment under law. Inside the packed courtroom, Judge Stevens called for order as the jury foreman, a retired teacher named Robert Chen, stood with the verdict form in his hands. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of air conditioning and the subtle rustle of clothing as hundreds of spectators leaned forward in anticipation. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Stevens asked, her voice carrying the gravity of the moment. "We have, Your Honor," Chen replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision he was about to announce. Theodore sat between Davis and his associate attorneys, his hands folded calmly in his lap, but his pulse racing with the knowledge that 23 years of service and dignity were about to be vindicated or dismissed by 12 strangers. Across the aisle, Megamart's legal team appeared resigned to their fate, their earlier confidence replaced by obvious anxiety. In the matter of Washington versus Megamart Corporation, Chen began. On the count of violation of civil rights under 42 U.S.C. Section 1981, we find in favor of the plaintiff. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, despite Judge Stevens's gavel calling for order. Theodore closed his eyes briefly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for months. On the count of intentional infliction of emotional distress, we find in favor of the plaintiff. On the count of negligent training and supervision, we find in favor of the plaintiff. Each verdict struck Megamart's defense team like physical blows, their faces growing paler with each finding of liability. The company that had spent millions on legal fees to avoid accountability was about to face the consequences of its discriminatory practices. Regarding damages, Chen continued, the jury awards compensatory damages in the amount of $200,000 to Mr. of Washington for the humiliation and emotional distress he suffered. The amount was substantial but not surprising given the evidence of systematic harassment. But Chen wasn't finished reading the verdict that would send shockwaves through corporate boardrooms nationwide. Additionally, the jury awards punitive damages in the amount of $15.7 million to be paid by Megamart Corporation as punishment for their discriminatory practices and to deter similar conduct in the future. The punitive damage award was staggering, representing one of the largest civil rights judgments in recent history. The message was unmistakable. Corporate America could no longer profit from discrimination without facing severe financial consequences. Judge Stevens struggled to maintain order as the courtroom erupted in celebration. Theodore remained seated, overwhelmed by the vindication, but also by the magnitude of responsibility that came with such a decisive victory. He had become the catalyst for change that he never sought to be. Furthermore, Chen concluded, the jury recommends that the court order Megamart Corporation to implement comprehensive policy changes to prevent future discrimination, including mandatory bias training for all employees and independent monitoring of customer interactions. As the verdict was officially recorded and the jury dismissed, Theodore finally stood to accept congratulations from his legal team. Davis's smile reflected not just professional satisfaction but personal vindication of his career-long commitment to civil rights advocacy. "Chief Washington," Davis said, shaking his client's hand warmly, "you've just achieved something remarkable. This verdict will protect countless future customers from the discrimination you suffered." The media circus outside the courthouse was unlike anything Theodore had previously experienced. Reporters from national news networks, international media outlets, and civil rights organizations sought statements about the verdict and its implications. Theodore addressed them briefly, his words carefully chosen to emphasize justice rather than personal victory. "This case was never about money," Theodore told the assembled crowd, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp autumn air. "It was about dignity, respect, and the principle that all Americans deserve to be treated fairly regardless of their race or appearance." He paused, looking out at the faces of supporters who had gathered to witness this moment. The jury's verdict sends a clear message that discrimination disguised as business policy will not be tolerated. Corporations that profit from prejudice will face consequences, and victims of discrimination will find justice in our legal system. The questions continued for 20 minutes, with Theodore deflecting personal inquiries to focus on the broader implications of the verdict. He thanked Isaiah Brown for his courage in testifying, acknowledged Keandra Johnson's crucial witness testimony, and praised his legal team for their dedication to justice. As the crowd began to disperse, Theodore found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him from a simple shopping trip to a landmark civil rights victory. The batteries he had never purchased for his grandson's toy car had become the catalyst for corporate policy changes that would protect millions of future customers. 6 months later, the impacts of Washington versus Megamart continued to reverberate across corporate America. The company had paid the full judgment and implemented comprehensive policy reforms under court supervision. David Hoffman had been terminated and was facing criminal charges for perjury during his deposition testimony. Patricia Manning had resigned in disgrace, her career in corporate security permanently damaged. More significantly, other retail chains had voluntarily revised their security policies rather than risk similar lawsuits. The Washington Standard had become shorthand for the legal and financial consequences of systematic discrimination, forcing companies to abandon profitable prejudice in favor of equitable treatment. Theodore had returned to his duties as Battalion Chief, but his role as an unwilling civil rights icon continued to follow him. Speaking invitations arrived weekly, and his mailbox overflowed with letters from people sharing their own experiences with discrimination. The financial settlement had secured his grandson's education and his own retirement, but the emotional rewards of preventing others from suffering similar humiliation were far more valuable. On a quiet Tuesday evening, almost exactly 1 year after the Megamart incident, Theodore finally purchased the batteries for his grandson's toy car. He chose a small local store, was treated with courtesy and respect, and completed his transaction without incident. As he walked to his truck with the small purchase that had started such a large journey, Theodore reflected on the strange paths that justice sometimes takes. He had never intended to become a civil rights champion, but circumstances had chosen him for that role, just as they had once chosen him to become a firefighter. The toy car roared back to life that evening, bringing joy to a 7-year-old boy who understood nothing of lawsuits or discrimination but everything about the love of a grandfather who kept his promises. Theodore watched his grandson play, knowing that the world the boy would inherit was slightly more just because one man had refused to accept humiliation in silence. The fight for dignity and respect continued across America, But the Washington versus Megamart verdict had proven that justice was still possible for those with the courage to demand it. Sometimes the greatest fires to fight were not the ones that threatened buildings, but the ones that burned away human dignity and civil rights. Theodore Washington had fought both kinds of fires with equal courage, and America was better for his service in every arena where he had chosen to stand his ground. The Battalion Chief had secured not just personal vindication, but a legacy of justice that would protect countless others from the discrimination he had endured and overcome. The truth had indeed found a way, just as he had promised it would from the very beginning. Justice had been served, and the taste of victory was sweeter than any fire chief could have imagined when he simply wanted to buy batteries for his grandson's toy. And just like that, the truth prevailed. A courageous man stood his ground, exposing systematic discrimination and demanding accountability from those who thought they were untouchable. This story isn't just about one victory. It's a reminder that standing up for what's right can change everything, even when the odds seem impossible.